How are you?
You want to hook them up?
Yes.
I guess maybe you should run through your text and get more good. Yeah, I will let you.
Well, good afternoon to all of you, and thank you very much for coming to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. It is my pleasure to welcome you here to this Directors Forum on the Office of the Vice Presidency. We're delighted to have our President of our Wilson Council here, Sam Donaldson, and many other supporters of the Center. The Vice Presidency has been an attractive subject for many commentators. John Adams, our first Vice President, once called it the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived or his imagination conceived. In turning down the Vice Presidency, Daniel Webster said, "I do not propose to be buried until I am really dead." Charles Dawes, Calvin Coolidge's vice president, described the job this way in speaking to a senator. "I can only do two things. One is sit up here and listen to you birds talk, and the other is to look at the newspapers every morning to see how the president's health is." Today, however, the vice presidency is an exceedingly powerful office. Recent vice presidents have been top advisors and national leaders in their own right and have taken on a broad range of responsibilities. The man who pioneered the new era of power and relevance for vice presidents is our guest today, Walter Mondale. As Jimmy Carter's vice president, Walter Mondale was heavily engaged in national and international affairs. He was the first vice president to have an office in the White House and to have weekly lunches with the president. He served the president as a top counselor and advocate for administration policy. Indeed, his active vice presidency has served as a model for the powerful vice presidents that followed. Like President Carter, Walter Mondale has grown in stature since leaving office. In 1984, he was the Democratic nominee for President of the United States. He made history as the first and only man to select a woman, Geraldine Farrar, as his running mate. In 1993, he was appointed ambassador to Japan, and he and Joan Mondale were exceedingly effective, enormously popular in Tokyo, popular with the Japanese people. Vice President Mondale was born and continues to reside in Minnesota, a product of Minnesota schools. He served his state as Attorney General and then as United States Senator from 1964 until his election to the Vice Presidency in 1976. Fritz, I'm often impressed by Minnesota's remarkable record of accomplished politicians. I think of you, I think of Vice President Humphrey, of course, I think of Walter Judd, I think of Hubert Humphrey and Gene McCarthy and Orville Freeman and many, many others. Today we'll hear Vice President Mondale's reflections on the office of the Vice Presidency. We will also hear from a very distinguished group of Americans. Stu Eizenstat, Chief Domestic Policy Advisor for President Carter, Deputy Treasury Secretary under President Clinton. Craig Fuller, Chief of Staff for Vice President Bush. He's held other very important posts in the White House. And unfortunately, Dick Moe, who had planned to be with us and who really deserves the credit for the idea of this convocation, is not able to be with us because of an illness. We all are thinking of Dick as he is unable to attend here today. And Al Isley, the former press secretary for Vice President Mondale and current public policy scholar here at the Center. Gentlemen, we welcome all of you to the Wilson Center, and we will begin with a few comments by the former Vice President Fritz Mondale. Fritz? Either way you prefer.
Thank you very much, Lee, for announcing I was the next speaker. I thought it was going to be Al Eisley, and that's the kind of rapid decision-making that you're known for. I'm honored to be introduced by one of America's truly remarkable public servants. I met Lee many, many years ago when we served together in the Congress, and what he's done for our country, what he does for our country, what he does as president of this remarkable Wilson Center draws all of our applause. I'm glad to be here with Al Eisley, and he'll be speaking in a moment. Al is from southern Minnesota, Blue Earth. If you ever get a map and you've got good eyes, you look right along the Iowa border there, you'll see a town of Blue Earth. That's his hometown. And then if you look 9 miles south of there, you'll see a town of Elmore. It's much smaller than Blue Earth. That's where I'm from. So we're the southern delegation. Dick Moe, Julia's here tonight. Dick Moe is from Duluth, Minnesota, and Mike Berman, if he's here, he's also from Duluth. So we had a balanced national staff there in the White House that we were very proud of. Craig, thank you for being with us tonight to help us get that perspective that we need. And to Stu Eizenstat, I worked with Stu in so many different ways. He's one of the truly spectacular people in public service, and I'm very glad he could take some time to add his comments about the vice presidency during that period. The room is full of people that I've worked with. I don't dare start down the names, but I know who you are, and I see you there. And sometime before the evening's over, we're going to have a chance to talk. And I think one of the most exciting things about public life is when you're through with active public service, discovering with time how close you stay with people who have gone through that experience with you, and how what you've been involved with, how you accepted those challenges, and the pressures under which you operated somehow binded you together in a remarkable relationship that lasts for a lifetime. And it means so much to me, and thank you for being here. I'm very grateful that we're talking about the vice presidency. We haven't done that for many years, but I've noticed that the last few years that scholars and historians and reporters, journalists, and editors are asking the question again about this unique office, about what its role should be, and what is the history that bears on that question. Since the start of our nation, the vice presidency has been, as Lee mentioned, an awkward office. Its occupants have by and large been notoriously unhappy. Jules Whitcover, I think, may be in the room. He just wrote a book about the warm relationship between Nixon and Agnew. That may not be the best of all relationships, but that adds to the literature. The Constitution assigns only one duty to the Vice President, and that is if he wants to, he can preside and, if needed, break a tie. Here is a public office. It's the only one in our government in which it is in two branches, both the executive and in the legislative branches of government. And yet, over most of its history, despite that remarkable fact, neither branch wanted to see him. David McCullough, in his masterful biography of John Adams, Lee mentioned that, but when Adams became the first vice president, he discovered that he had nothing to do in the executive branch, so he decided that he'd preside over the Senate and be involved in the debate, make suggestions to the Senate, and more or less be a partner with the Senate in all of its work. And he reports that the Senate did not like that version of the vice presidency, and they shut him down, to put it mildly. And he's quoted as saying, "I have no desire ever to open my mouth again on any question." And he didn't know it, but he was describing it in a predictive way, the condition of the vice president over the next 200 years. Even Lyndon Johnson, the most powerful of senators, majority leaders, was a miserable man as vice president. And in Caro's wonderful history, Master of the Senate, he said that even Johnson understood that he had lost all of his power so completely that he'd become almost a figure of ridicule in the Capitol. But it changed. And I think it changed to a good extent because of the special person that President Carter was and is. When we were first talking about running together, I told him that I loved the Senate. I did not want to leave the Senate for what we'd seen in the past. And in fact, I thought I could help him more in the Senate than I could in such a thin role in the White House. And he said, you know, I've been thinking about this, and I think that we should have a different role for the vice president. And when we got all done with it, he came up with an idea that has since been called the executivization of the vice president. Instead of being sort of on the hill, sort of somewhere, the vice president moved into the White House, was involved in all aspects of the presidency, was informed of all the same information as the president, the same secret, the same classified information, I often met 2, 3, 4 hours a day with the president when events were intense, and I was able, through the way he opened up the office for me, to be able to be, I think, of significant help. Now we're opening up the classified records of the vice president, and they're available at the Carter Library and increasingly at the Minnesota Historical Society. And it's a whole room of classified documents, of memcons, of conversations that were involved in some of my foreign trips, in all of the security and other matters that I was intensely involved in. And the unique thing about it was that it had never happened before. This was a first. We had no law. We had no constitutional roadmap. There were no precedents. How the president and I worked that out was simply by day-to-day experience, except we had one basic document that Dick Moe wrote. I'm sorry he's not here tonight because he would have so much to add to our discussion tonight. And this was based on a discussion that the president and I and Dick Moe had, and we spelled out the elements of what we thought I should be doing as vice president. And I think that worked out exactly as it was planned, and we were able through those 4 years to do a lot of things together that I think helped the president. Many, many international assignments, many very sensitive assignments within the executive branch, up on the Hill on all the many of the central questions, the political issues, of course, around the country, and so on. And I think one of the reasons that I was able to be helpful was the word quickly got out that this was different now. That when I spoke, I was speaking for the president, and I was acting on his behalf, and that when I was doing so, they had a right to assume that they were hearing from the president. what our idea was not to have a co-president, not to have a prime minister, not to have somebody who, in effect, substitutes for the president, but to have someone who helps the president, advises the president, stays away from functions within the executive branch in order to remain available for that purpose. I think it really worked, and it worked for all those 4 years. We had some really tough times when the pressure was on us in an unbelievable way. Carter was one of those politicians that I always said liked to front-load pain and backload pleasure. And that's an ideal job for a vice president, to explain that order. And so we were we took the Panama Canal issue. We took the energy issue early on before the public really understands, as it does now, how serious that is. We took on some of the toughest fights on the Hill. You remember the Western Water Dam projects and so on. And, I thought my job was to discuss these issues in private with him, but once the decision was made, I tried to help in every way I could. And through these 4 years, our relationship remained solid. I respect him, I respected him, and I think he felt the same way about me. And even now, we remain friends, which is a rare thing for presidents and former vice presidents. But we did. What I'm worried about is I think it worked. I think it changed the way the vice president is seen in American life. And I think it's been valuable in serving the effectiveness of our government, both here and abroad. But we see challenges now, and that's why I think all future presidents have abandoned the earlier model and basically followed that precedent that was established by President Carter. And I remember talking to the Vice President-elect Bush about this whole matter when he was shaping his vice presidency. But I think there's a problem now, and the problem, I'm going to be frank about it, is that, as I mentioned, I saw my role as helping the president, advising him. When I had differences, I aired them in private with him, because I think a vice president who goes around with his own agenda in the executive branch and presses issues or tries to press the intelligence agencies and other key departments upon which the president must depend for independent and honest advice, doing so raises the risk that the president will be poorly served by the pressured information that comes to him as a result of that. People in the executive branch want to do what the president wants them to do. They want to be seen by the president in those terms. But if they think the vice president is speaking for him, or may be speaking for him, and moves around in a way that I fear has been the case, it can undermine and have a negative effect on the effectiveness of the presidency. I often ask, well, what did you accomplish during your administration? And I give the same answer. I said, we told the truth, we obeyed the law, and we kept the peace. It doesn't sound like much, no more than what it should be expected. But I think we're finding out again, the hard way, the tremendous costs that are paid if you don't live up to those basic values. Lincoln once said something that means a lot to me about public trust. He said, with it, everything is possible. Without it, nothing is possible. And for whatever problems we had during our 4 years, I think both the president and myself tried to be faithful to that goal. Thank you.
going to exercise my prerogative as the moderator here and call on Stu Eizenstat to respond first, and then Craig Fuller, and then I'll say a few things.
Great. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here again with the Vice President. We had an unusually close relationship and have maintained that. I began my public career as a junior assistant after law school in the Johnson White House. And my office in the old Executive Office building was directly next to the office of the Vice President, to Hubert Humphrey's office, and I worked very closely and knew all of his senior staff. And through them was reflected the disappointments that Vice President Humphrey had in being included in the decision-making process, and indeed oftentimes humiliation of standing outside the President's domestic advisor's office waiting a half an hour to get in to see him. The first time that Hubert Humphrey went to Camp David was not as Vice President, but when President Carter invited him in his dying months in office. Fritz Mondale played a very critical role even before the inauguration. He was extremely important, and indeed one of the reasons that he was selected as Vice President by Jimmy Carter was first because Jimmy Carter wanted to have someone who had experience in Washington and a Senate background. He came in as an unknown factor, someone who had not been to Washington before, and he needed that ballast that Vice President Mondale would provide. Second, he was also the outreach to the liberal constituency with which Carter had virtually no relationship. And during the campaign was critical in rallying labor, consumers, the minority community on behalf of the ticket. The debate that he had with Senator Dole in '76, which began the vice presidential debates, was absolutely seminal. There's no question but that in a very, very close election in which we won by 0.5%, that debate was one of the seminal factors. Now, I want to try to place the Vice President and his role in the context of how the White House staff was organized. The President had run against Watergate, had run against the imperial presidency, and as a result, in part because of that and in part because of advice we got from a presidential scholar at Brookings, Stephen Hess, who had worked in some of the Republican White Houses, we did not have a hierarchical White House staff with a strong, or indeed any, chief of staff. We worked on what was called in the Kennedy White House the spokes of the wheel concept, in which you had 5 or 6 senior aides, each of whom had the same direct access to the President, but that means that the President had to be his own chief of staff. This led to very real problems in the first year or so of the administration. The absence of a White House chief of staff meant that there was a failure to set priorities. We were overwhelming Congress, as the Vice President was implying, with a whole raft of often conflicting legislation. There was a lack of coordination of cabinet departments, each going their own way. There was little coordination between the domestic and foreign policy sides of the White House, and there was a real difficulty in that first year or so. Now, this is where the Vice President comes in, and so let me put him in the context of that problem and more broadly. He really created, along with President Carter, the modern Vice Presidency. There's no question about it. I think everyone who has followed since would say that. He was the first to recognize the importance of having his office in the West Wing just a few yards away from the Oval Office. And he gave up, as a result, the magnificent ceremonial office in the old Executive Office building, the one that Humphrey and every Vice President had since that office was built, for a very cramped West Wing office. And when he was asked early in his Vice Presidency why he had traded such a magnificent office for a much smaller space in the West Wing, he said, "If you're in the old Executive Office building, you might as well be in Baltimore." And that proximity was critically important to make sure that he understood and was part of every decision. As was suggested, and this was another innovation that I think has been followed ever since, he and President Carter initiated one-on-one lunches, no note-takers, no preset agenda, just the two of them for an hour over lunch religiously every week discussing any issue that was important. In that respect, he kept the President's confidence. There was not once in 4 years a leak out of that meeting, and the trust that he built up with the President was critical in being able to give him the unvarnished advice that he did. Getting all the paper flow would seem to be an obvious thing, but it was not done before Mondale came in. He got all the paper flow that went to the President, and importantly, his staff got all the paper flow, classified and unclassified. His staff was invited to all of our staff meetings and all of our interagency meetings, so that, for example, Gail Harrison, who was his domestic advisor, and David Aaron, who was his national security advisor, were in on all of our meetings, in on all of the interagency meetings, and knew from start to finish everything that was happening. The Vice President knew Washington well, and early on during the transition, he made sure that he placed his people not just on his own staff, but on our staff. For example, I thought that I had my deputy picked in David Rubenstein, who's since gone on to lavishly important things, and David had been my deputy during the campaign, and I got a call from Mr. Mondale saying, Stu, I've got a great guy I'd like you to have as your deputy. And I said, well, Mr. Vice President, I have a deputy, David Rubenstein. He said, well, now you have a second, Bert Karp, who is my budget director. And he did the same thing with the NSC. David Aaron became Zbig's deputy national security advisor from his staff, so that he wasn't simply relying on getting the paper flow and being included by the President's staff. He was putting his own people in key places in the White House staff. He also participated importantly in the Friday foreign policy breakfasts. Very strictly limited principles only, the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, National Security Advisor, the President, and the Vice President. And that was seminal to make sure that he was included in all major foreign policy decisions. Rather than being given, as LBJ was when he was Kennedy's Vice President, a sort of line responsibility for the space program and then shunted off to that, the Vice President was involved in all major decision-making processes. At the end of each budget cycle, before the President sent up his budget, all of which were lean and very tight, and therefore likely to offend many of the Democratic Party constituency groups with which the Vice President was close, we had a regular ritual, which is the Vice President and I would go into the small den next to the Oval Office, and the President would give us the discretion to add a couple of $1 billion back to the domestic budget for Head Start, youth employment, Medicaid, things that we knew were important to try to keep the liberal wing of the party at least somewhat placated. And that was very critical in funding these programs and in giving us some outreach to groups that otherwise would have vacated our administration even quicker than they ultimately did. There was one other thing that I want to add which was really absolutely critical, and that is at the end of the first year, when it became obvious that we had in fact overwhelmed the Congress with conflicting priorities and major pieces of legislation, the President asked the Vice President to organize a priority-setting mechanism which then lasted the next and following 3 years of the administration. The Vice President, working with Gail and his staff, David Aaron, would send out a note to each cabinet secretary saying, give me your legislative priorities for the coming calendar year, and rank them on which ones you want as top presidential priorities where there would be significant presidential time and energy, White House priorities where you would expect the White House to be involved, cabinet secretary and priorities, and then below that. And then we would vet those, and through our internal processes led by the Vice President, we would make recommendations to the President of how to prioritize those recommendations, and then ultimately the report would come back to the cabinet officers of which 2 or 3 priorities were going to be top presidential priorities. Had that been done at the beginning of the administration, I can assure you there would have been a very different image of Jimmy Carter, because one of the things we suffered from was the perception that we couldn't get our major legislation through the Congress in the first year. The fact is we got a large part of it through by the end of the second year. We got most of our energy legislation, but we suffered grievously from the perception that with a heavily Democratic Congress we didn't get those initial priorities because there were too many of them. That really got better in the next 3 years because of the Vice President. So when we talk about the Vice Presidency as an institution today, the man here is the person, along with President Carter, who really created it and implemented it, and I think it's a stronger office, and we're better off for it as a result of Fritz Mondale and Jimmy Carter.
Thank you, Stu.
Thank you, Stu.
We're going to hear from Craig Fuller in a second, but I would add to your comment about the importance of Mr. Mondale placed in being in the West Wing, which he summed up in his frequent comment that nothing propinque's like propinquity. So, Craig Fuller.
Thank you. First, I'd like to thank the Wilson Center for hosting us, and especially Lee Hamilton. You know, it's said that Republicans should get used to feeling like they're in the minority, and Lee's helped me with that this afternoon. But I am very pleased to be part of this distinguished panel. My reflections, I really want to start by publicly thanking Vice President Mondale. I had the wonderful good fortune to be Chief of Staff to a Vice President for 4 years, Vice President Bush, for the second term of the Reagan-Bush time in the White House. And there is no doubt in my mind that not only had Jimmy Carter not been the kind of president he was and wanted you to be the kind of Vice President that you were, but had you not conducted yourself in that office and proven that it could be done in a way that is a real support to the administration and the country, I don't think that office would be viewed the way it is today, nor do I think the following vice presidents would have been able to serve in the way they've been able to do. It's been said, and it's absolutely true, that geography in the White House makes a lot of difference. I'm sure all of us get asked, I know I do whenever I'm out speaking, you know, is the show The West Wing what it's really like? And while there are some things that are pretty accurate, the one thing that's completely inaccurate is how big the White House is and how big the West Wing is. Yeah. It's very small, and those who have real estate there definitely are closer to being in the loop than anyone else. And that was a big difference. I thought, and as I reflected on what we might talk about today, and as you were speaking, I thought about 3 or 4 things. First, I think it's the relationship that's so crucial between two individuals. And it's so unusual in our political situation because you have two people whom have been elected, who came together for the purpose of winning the presidency, but typically don't have a long experience in working together. One can't fire the other, unlike cabinet officers and staff. And so you're kind of stuck there. And it is what you choose to make of it. And I think you have to start by examining any vice presidency by really understanding that relationship. And it is remarkable that up until Vice President Mondale, you had vice presidents who had to literally get cleared into the White House to come see the president, which is sort of hard to imagine now. But that was, in fact, the case. Vice President Humphreys, I think, spent most of his time in his Senate office. The other thing I learned when I got there, and I'd been at the White House for 4 years, was that a vice president actually has actually, Vice President Bush had 2 offices at the White House. He decided to claim Baltimore, so we retook the ceremonial office. He had the West Wing office. He had the Senate office. And then they told me, after I'd been there for about a month, when I was looking at a budget, they said, well, do you know about the Texas office? I said, the Texas office? What in the world do we have an office in Texas for? And as the leader of the Senate, he was entitled to an office in his home state. So we actually had a Texas office, something that most White House officials were very jealous of, all the real estate we occupied. The second point I would make is that and maybe you'll be willing to talk a little bit about this, but I think the sublimation that has to occur for the individual who is vice president is remarkable. In our certainly modern history, at least the ones I know, especially Vice President Mondale and Vice President Bush, are people who are leaders. They have led most of their lives. Businesses, they've led in Congress, they've led in political life. They've gone on to continue to be leaders in whatever they've done after they've left. So they are, by every definition, leaders. And yet as vice president, they're asked not to lead, but to be ready in the event something happens. And I always thought that one of the most remarkable things about Vice President Bush was his ability to participate fully, but to do so privately, and when there were differences, and there were, as I'm sure there were for you, publicly not discuss it. Because everything up to the point of being vice president usually causes an individual to go out and publicly proclaim what they believe. And so I think that the ability to sublimate your own views and attitudes about things to some extent is a remarkable attribute for a very good and strong vice president. The other word that comes to mind is confidant. And I think that I know from everything I read, certainly heard today, that you were very much a confidant to President Carter. I know Vice President Bush was a confidant to President Reagan. And I think that the measure of the effectiveness for a vice president relates to the degree to which they are truly a confidant, not just because it's power in the sense of Washington, but because it gives the administration at the very top the ability to conduct foreign policy and congressional relations in ways that otherwise would not be possible. I'm a great admirer of cabinet members and those who serve in the departments and agencies. But it is concerning, and Stu and I could probably talk about this too, when cabinet officers travel and have meetings with heads of state, there are note takers present. There is a whole administration that requires the feeding of information, appropriately so. But in any other thing we do in life, when you're negotiating or trying to get to know somebody, you don't do it with note takers present. I had the good fortune to go in the course of 4 years to over 60 countries with Vice President Bush. And we had note takers. But in every one of those visits, we had a private meeting. Private usually meant, sometimes it was just two, but it usually meant the head of state and their person, the vice president and myself. The only people who had a sort of a readout of that meeting, or the only person from Vice President Bush, was President Reagan. And so the head of state that was being visited knew that he could depend upon that relationship between the vice president and President Reagan as a conduit for some of the most sensitive things he or she might want to pass. And I think that we lose that if there isn't a kind of a confidence that exists between a president and vice president. The last point I'll touch upon, and you got into it a little bit, is it's the role of the vice president as a candidate. And this is a little delicate, but you know, I think that we are seeing something quite remarkable by having a sitting vice president who's not seeking the presidency at the end of 8 years. Not suggesting anything be done about it, but I think the fact that this administration doesn't have a standard bearer out there in the campaign and doesn't have an individual who has for this entire second term or the entire term sought or had a notion that he might be president through election, I think that's had an impact. I think the political antenna is not as good in some ways. I think that perhaps the conduct of the vice president's affected by it. I know that one of the things that Vice President Bush struggled with as he campaigned, and that, you know, pretty hard particularly the last 2 years of his vice presidency, was he had to appear to always be in the loop, yet we were traveling constantly, and yet he couldn't be disagreeing with the president and have sort of his legs cut out from under him. And yet the campaign almost every day would call and say, you know, he's got to differentiate somehow from President Reagan. But that balancing act, I think, serves an administration well. And I think that this administration doesn't have that advantage, and that perhaps there are some consequences to that. But it's a great pleasure, and I would say it's really terrific that the Wilson Center is conducting this program, and hopefully others, because I think there's a lot to learn. No corporation in America that I am aware of spends, or dismisses the notion that you should be concerned about a successor. And yet I don't think in the political process we think a lot about the importance of that, and that really is the role of the Vice President, should he need to be one, or should he choose to run for office. And so, again, thank you definitely for being here, and thank you for changing the dimensions of the job in ways that I think have benefited the country in a very fundamental way.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. I think all three of the previous speakers have really said much more than I could possibly say about the role of the Vice Presidency. But I want to say a couple of things from a personal perspective. First of all, I was very fortunate to have the privilege and honor of working for Mr. Mondale. I covered him as a reporter for Minnesota newspapers. I came here just shortly, a few months after he came to the Senate, and I covered him all that period. And he was asked after he hired me why he had hired me, and he said he wanted to get me out of journalism, which he did, but I'm back in it now. There are a lot of people here who wish that Vice President Mondale, including myself, wish that Vice President Mondale had been able to shorten his title in 1968 or 1984, and I wish he had, because I believe he would have made a great president. Incidentally, most of you don't know this, but Al Gore has nothing on Mr. Mondale when it comes to being a champion of the environment, because last week in St. Paul, the National Park Service made him an honorary National Park Ranger for his work in protecting the wild and scenic rivers of St. Croix. So salute him for that. As I picked Mr. Mondale up at the Senate, and we took him to the Hay Adams where he's staying, and I walked from there over to my office at the Hill, which is just a block or two away. As we were going over there, we ran into a group of about 20 young black kids, 4 or 5 years old, in one of the daycare centers. And I stopped and I said, "Would you like to meet the former Vice President of the United States?" And this one little girl said to me, "What is a Vice President?" But they all shook his hand, and they asked questions about. One of them said, "Did you live there in the White House?" And of course he explained that he worked there. But I told him afterwards, I said that these kids are going to be talking about that for the rest of their lives, about the experience of meeting a Vice President. So, and then I took him over to the Hill, and we have most of our reporters are young reporters who have not had a lot of experience, and they crowded around him and asked him a lot of questions. And again, that was for them, I think, a great experience. I want to recognize several people here, particularly Marty Sabo, former congressman from Minneapolis, who just retired. We Minnesota chauvinists are quick to point out that we now have 2 committee chairmen from Minnesota, Jim Oberstar, Transportation and Infrastructure, and Colin Peterson of Agriculture, and we would have had 3 had Marty decided not to retire. But I had the privilege of covering him throughout his career as well. And also, I don't know if former Congressman Bill Frenzel from Minnesota is here. He was, I hope he is. He was on the list. And then several of my colleagues on Mr. Mondale's staff: Mike Berman, counsel, Gail Harrison, both of whom have been referred to, Bill Roberts, who was the head of our advance team, and Bess Abel, who was Joan Mondale's press secretary, assistant, and also a couple of other people, Al Moses, who was in the Carter administration, my friend Jim Symington from Missouri, and I'll leave it there at the risk of not recognizing some other people that I should. I want to illustrate, I want to talk about the fact that I had a very easy job because Mr. Mondale knew how to deal with the press. And basically he knew, he was comfortable with reporters, he was open with them, and you don't have to have much of an imagination to compare him with the current Vice President to see how that contrast works. If you deal openly and honestly with the press, you'll generally get treated fairly well, and he certainly did. I started off my career as a Vice Presidential Press Secretary with a bang. We went to President Carter sent Vice President Mondale and his staff to on a trip right after the inauguration to Western Europe and Japan. And we went through Paris and Rome and so forth. We got to London, and Prime Minister Jim Callaghan threw a lavish party at number 10 Downing Street, which served some very nice wine. And I, being new to the system to briefing the press, gave them a little too detailed description of our dinner. And this was a time of great austerity in London, in the UK. And we left then and went to Tokyo. And halfway around the world, Mr. Mondale got a call from Anne Armstrong, our ambassador in London, and said, Prime Minister Callaghan is outraged at what your press secretary said about the lavish wines that we served at the dinner. Fortunately, Mr. Mondale never mentioned that to me. I've heard it otherwise from other people, but I figured that my career was over then, particularly when I got back here and Dick Moe told me that President Carter had asked at the senior staff meeting the next morning, who is this easel? So I think to illustrate the great difference between the way that the vice presidency was before Carter Mondale was that my predecessor, Norm Sherman, who was press secretary to Hubert Humphrey, who I had covered also and written a book about, and I can tell you his time in the vice presidency was not a pleasant time for reasons you all know. But Norm Sherman once told me that my office was in the executive office building across the street from the White House, as his was, and he once told me that in the 4 years he worked for Hubert Humphrey, he was in the White House only about 4 times. And I was back and forth there 4 times or more every day. So illustrating the way we were treated as equals by the Carter staff, and that made it enormously more interesting and enjoyable and I think productive. And I think that there's no doubt in my mind that Jimmy Carter and Fitz Mondale established the model for all future vice presidents. You look at the way that George H.W. Bush and Dan Quayle and Al Gore and Dick Cheney, all of them have operated in much the same manner. The other thing I would say is that Mr. Mondale referenced the fact that the vice president is the only member of the executive branch who has a foot also in the legislative branch as the presiding officer of the Senate. Now that doesn't work out to be much of a job because throughout American history, the vice president's role is presiding over the Senate and breaking tie votes. He's had to do that only about once a year over 200 years, so that's not enough to keep you busy. But Mr. Mondale, because he had been in the Senate and knew everybody on the Hill, provided a very good listening post, I think, for President Carter, and some of it was probably not very pleasant, but he kept the president and Stu and others informed about what was on the minds of Congress and what their concerns were. I think that's another reason why the Mondale vice presidency worked so well. As I said that I had written a book about Hubert Humphrey, and when Mr. Mondale asked me to go to work for him, I had in the front of my mind what a terrible experience it had been for Mr. Humphrey, and I mentioned that to him, and he assured me that he and Carter had a good relationship, that it would be a different type of relationship, and that vice presidency would be different than it was, and I was delighted to learn that it was when I got into the job. The other thing I'd like to say is that I'm very privileged to work here to be here as a fellow, a public policy scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. When I tell my friends what I'm doing, they say, "You're a scholar?" And I say, "I have papers to prove it." But opportunity to work with Lee Hamilton, for whom I have the greatest respect, and for the wonderful scholars and people that they have here at the center has been a great experience. This is my swan song because tomorrow I'm turning in my badge and key. I'm finishing my scholarship here, but it has been a terrific experience. I must say that Lee Hamilton has been front and center on on what I think is the most important issue of our time, which is the Iraq War. I spent 2 weeks in Iraq recently, and I have some feel for it, I think, and I am personally not terribly optimistic about I'm not at all optimistic, as a matter of fact, about the outcome, but that remains to be seen. We are at a rather historic time of confrontation between the executive branch and the Congress right now over that very issue. I don't know how it's going to come out, but I think that the work that Lee Hamilton and the Iraq Study Group have done is going to make a huge contribution to perhaps finding some way to resolve that situation. I'm going to open up the floor to questions now and invite any of you to ask questions, but I'm going to use my prerogative as the moderator and ask the first question, Mr. Vice President. And as you know, when I was reporter, I asked a lot of tough questions of you. Then I went to work for you, and I couldn't ask tough questions, but now I'm no longer working for you, so I can. So I'm going to ask a very tough question. I expect a direct and candid answer, and that is, how do you manage to remain so vigorous and youthful looking at your age? Seriously. I'd like to know what what you regard as the greatest challenge that President Bush and the Bush administration face in the remaining time in office, as well as the next president, whoever he or she is. And in general, what is the greatest challenge that faces the American people in the next few years?
I think it's the restoration of public trust. When Reagan stumbled in the middle of his administration and his polls started dropping, I think it was essentially because people weren't sure they could trust what he was saying. And he, with the Vice President's help, made some big changes, not only in the White House, bringing Howard Baker and moderate progressive leaders that were well known and respected, but he changed his direction. He reached out to the moderates in his party, the Democratic Party, emphasized more than he had international arms control and peace issues. And within 2 years, he had restored that public trust. And he left office with very strong public approval, which he would not have had unless he'd done this basic restructuring. And I believe that Bush is in a worse, is bad, but I believe it's a worse spot because you've got the war. The public is very, very skeptical about what has been told and what's happening there. I'm told by people who are running now, they hear it every meeting they go to. People want this thing resolved. They want their leaders to be talking together civilly about how it can be resolved. They don't see that happening. You know, it's the arguments, the facts that have been used surrounding it and some other issues have not proven to pan out, and big things. Mm-hmm. And those things are not just forgotten. And I think it's sucking the oxygen out of almost every big question that we confront, whether it's arms control or nuclear weapons are the most dangerous thing, or trying to get some momentum and some kind of sensible approach in the Middle East, and trying to get other countries to help us in resolving Iraq, or just a whole range of issues. I don't think we even get to those questions now because we're so paralyzed, so traumatized, so divided, so unsure of our leadership that we can't get to it. And that's got to change, or we're not going to solve it. And that's not, I don't think that's going to be just Bush's last 2 years. I think we're going to be struggling with this for a long time. We've got to get that deficit down. We've got to get something going on. That's enough. But I mean, I think you've got to have trust, or you can't do it.
I'm going to ask the panelists to also give them an opportunity to ask a question if they want. Craig?
Mr. Vice President, you know, I think when people think about what goes into choosing a vice president, there are a lot of theories. Yeah. I can't think of two individuals better qualified to expound on what needs to go into that choice than the person for whom I worked, Vice President Bush, or you. In both cases, when you had the opportunity to do it, I think you chose very bold, you made bold choices. Whether people politically agree or disagree, they were seen at the time, and I think today as bold choices. The next president, as you rightfully point out, is going to face some enormous challenges. We've talked a lot about the past, but I wonder what you think a nominee, and there'll be two of them, what do you think a nominee should think about in selecting his or her vice president?
They will think about balancing the ticket in a way that they can get elected. There's no way of taking that out of the process. But I think they ought to ask the first question, is that person qualified to be president? Because that's what the public's going to ask. And if it clears that hurdle, what other qualities does that person bring in conducting government? Will I be able to have a positive and productive personal relation? Will it last for 4 or 8 years under the pressure, the tremendous pressure? Is the person honest? Can I trust him? You know, well, that's a good list. There's other things they have to look at depending on the circumstances. And you brought up a point that I was going to mention. You know, it is so ironic that neither the president, because of the 2-year term limit, nor the vice president are interested or can run again. And you might say, well, that's good because that means they can just concentrate on the job and, unlike those old politicians, really get it done. But I worry. I don't think it works that way. I think that the Constitution and the election system was intended to produce sleepless nights with politicians. So all day long you worry, whatever you're working on, will the public accept this or not? Is this sustainable with the American people? And the fact of it is, anything that counts that we do in America, if it doesn't connect with the American people, you're not going to get it done. One way or another, they'll take it back. And I think there's a kind of an insularity, a disconnect that occurs when you take politics out of a political office. In a strange way, it makes politicians anxious for re-election look a little bit better, which they rarely do. But I think that ought to be kept in mind here.
Stu, did you have a question?
No, I think we ought to let the audience weigh in.
All right. If you would just identify yourself, ask your question, and remember, after this, we're going to have a reception, so if you don't get a question in, you can talk to the Vice President then. Yes, right here. I think there's a mic here for you. Oh, it's right there. Sam knows how to do it.
I've never seen him give a microphone away.
Take it.
Given the hidden influence...
Identify yourself, if you would, please.
My name is Marion Golden, and given the hidden influence and power and secrecy of this current Vice President Cheney, might we all have been better off if you hadn't forged the modern vice presidency and Vice President Cheney had come to the White House maybe only 4 times in these 6 years?
I thought about that. I think the experience has been positive, but this is something I never thought of, and I don't think anybody thought that this person could go over the line. Now, all I'm doing is basing this on what I read. But what I read is that the vice president was seen over the CIA pressing these agencies to tell the president that the elements of now what we know was a false range of arguments for the war were in fact true. I think that's an immense disservice. I believe that whether you're a Democrat or a Republican in high office, one of your duties is to try to keep the country together. to keep some kind of sense of community. Mr. Cheney has used the vice presidency, I think, as a very harsh, belligerent bully pulpit. If something can be said that's really mean, sooner or later he'll say it. And I don't think it just ends there. And so I think what we need to do, and that's why I said in my remarks, I hope scholars and historians and political scientists and people will sit down and ask what this means for the future. Because it is, I think it is unsettling.
I do think as a consequence, though, of
Yeah.
the phenomenon we witnessed, however you wish to characterize it, that in the course of this campaign, the president and his or her nominee are going to have to go to much greater lengths to explain to the American people, the media, just what that relationship is going to be like and what that role is going to be like.
Yeah.
I actually believe, that there are so much, a president has the capability at any moment he wishes to do so to pull back a vice president.
Yeah.
That, however you wish to characterize the phenomenon, it wouldn't happen unless there was agreement between the two parties.
Yeah.
And I think but I do think this campaign is going to put more of a spotlight, as the vice president suggested. Scholars are already coming to us and talking about this relationship more. I think it'll put more of a spotlight on, and I think it should.
I'd hate to see him drop the precedent, but I'd like to see him deal with the question you raised.
Well, we should go back to what model was created and was followed up to this point, which was to have the vice president fully involved in all decision making, having the vice president serve as the president's senior advisor, but not as someone who's supposed to drive an agenda of his own or perhaps even the president's, unless the president specifically wants to. Now, one of the things that scholars will have to look at when they look at the Bush administration is it's hard to believe that this would have occurred with respect to the current vice president if the president didn't want it to occur. So one has to assume that that's one of the roles that you have, and therefore perhaps the positive thing about it is not that you want to retreat from the modern vice presidency, but that when we have another election campaign, that the voters will pay greater attention than they have to the running mate.
Over here.
Twice in our lifetime, we've had a situation where a nominee for president regretted the choice that he had made for vice president. In 1972, Eagleton was forced off, and I think few would disagree that in 1988 this thought occurred to George Bush. And one case, where he swallowed hard and kept him. So what are your thoughts about what a nominee for president should do when it becomes clear that he or she has fouled up?
Well, I think you have to correct it, but it can be very challenging. It was mentioned here earlier that the president and vice president have to have that confidence together, and any moment that a president decides to drop that, to move the vice president back to where he was, wherever that can happen. So a president can nullify the presence of a vice president and his influence, but the only thing he'd ask him to quit, I guess. I don't know just what other remedies are around. The president couldn't very well ask to impeach his vice president, I don't think. I talked about Jules Whitcover's book, and I read Al's review of it. Apparently, Nixon couldn't stand the sight of Agnew. And I read that in Dalek's book, too, that when Agnew wanted to come and see him, he wouldn't see him. So finally he had to see him. He'd always see him at 5 o'clock in the evening. So when Agnew would come through the door, Nixon was putting on his coat to leave for the next meeting. And then Agnew, according to this most recent book, Nixon wanted Agnew to speak at the Gridiron Club. And Agnew said he wouldn't do it unless Nixon asked him personally. Nixon wouldn't ask him personally, so he finally sent him a personal note, and that did the trick. But when you have a relationship like that, it's not inspiring. And
actually, I was thinking back to 1988. At the convention with Vice President Bush, the selection of Dan Quayle, who was someone that had been on our foreign policy advisory group, was widely supported by Brent Scowcroft and John Tower and others, had co-sponsored with Senator Kennedy a Job Training Partnership Act. We saw him as a candidate who could help us with the domestic policy front. Some of our political advisors on the Bush campaign had worked in Senator Quayle's senatorial campaigns and knew him as a very able campaigner and knew precisely. It wasn't like it was a surprise that he'd been in the National Guard. But frankly, the reaction at that convention to his nomination caused at least the political staff to raise the question, should we drop him? If there was any, there were about 6 of us who kind of organized the campaign for Vice President Bush. Some are not with us today, but I think if any of us could have been asked the question, what's the one decision you would have made differently in the context of an entire presidential campaign? It's not the selection of Dan Quayle, in my case anyway. It's the early announcement of him at our convention. Because as Sam well knows, the dynamics of a convention put all the political operatives and all the highly charged media in one place for 4 days. And you can't sustain it. You can't sustain an issue if you start too early. And because we surprised people with a bold choice, what we got was not celebrating a bold choice, we got all kinds of questions. I don't believe that Vice President Bush ever entertained the idea at the convention to change his choice of Dan Quayle. I do think it is, and I enjoyed asking you the question because I don't exactly know why George Bush picked Dan Quayle. We had a whole process, which is another story, but it's a very personal choice. Yeah. And for the person who is a sitting vice president to make it, it is really interesting, I think, to understand how they get there, if you will. The other telling moment, however, came in the re-election campaign for President Bush, because clearly there were senior people at the campaign who looked at the polls and said, you're going to lose this. Now, I did just a little bit of work and do a little bit of reading before this event. But when you think back, sitting vice presidents in re-election campaigns have not always been the greatest help to the ticket. Nixon took votes away from Eisenhower, for example. You go back and so it's the calculation in a re-election effort as to whether a vice president's going to help or hurt. Historically, they tend not to help much. The question is, how much will they really hurt you? I certainly think it goes back to this notion of the relationship between two individuals. Whatever that discussion is between those two individuals when the relationship begins, it ought to include a termination clause. It ought to include an understanding that if we're serving together, pick on Stu, if we're serving together, I'd be vice president, of course. There ought to be an understanding that if I'm no longer contributing and an attribute to his administration, I had to step away. The tough part is, how do you convince the vice president that that point in time has arrived? Now, the Washington Press Corps helps with that a lot. Well, just not run again. Just indicate they're not going to run again. I'm sorry. Because we're talking about the context of a re-election. He could resign, but that'd be a little dramatic. And I think also in the modern presidency and vice presidency that we are envisioning, the role is sufficiently important, or should be, that if the two just aren't getting along, maybe resignation is a consideration. I do think when you get to the moment, though, of re-election, there ought to be a predetermined understanding that you're going to confront it honestly. I've never met a president, I don't know about, I'm sure Stu says it, who found it easy, or in some cases even possible, to fire anybody. I've done the firing for them. I've never found a president, including President
We
Reagan.
found one who fired the whole cabinet.
So it's not unusual that discussion would be a hard one to have. But I think it's an important one to sort of have a pre-agreement on.
You have to remember that there was no vice president chosen. It was more of a surprise than Spiro Agnew at the Miami convention. I covered Agnew's first speech as a candidate at the Jack Tar Hotel in San Francisco before the Portuguese American Society, and I must say I was fairly impressed with him. He was very articulate and smart. Bob Boyd of the Knight Ridder newspapers wrote one of the great leads of all time. He said, "Spiro Agnew, the name that launched 1,000 quips." I also want to say in a personal anecdote relating to Mr. Mondale, it sometimes requires a little bit of deceitfulness to be a successful candidate for vice president. When he went down to Plains for his job interview with Jimmy Carter, I flew down with him and Joan, and we stayed overnight at the Atlanta Hilton Airport, and Skip Carter picked us up in his airplane the next morning to fly us down to Plains. We had breakfast at the Hilton that morning, and they served grits, as they do in the South. I grew up, my mother was from the South, and I often had grits for breakfast. I knew what they were. And they served Mr. Mondale a plate of grits, and he said, he poked at it with his fork, and he said, "What the hell is this?" And I said, "Those are grits, Senator." And he didn't touch it, of course. And then we got on the plane and flew down to Plains, and Sam Donaldson greeted him at the airport and said, "Senator," they had this Fritz and grits thing. He said, "Senator, do you like grits?" And he said, "Of course. I just had them this morning for breakfast."
I'd like to just say one thing. We're talking about difficulties that president, vice presidents have. I'd just like to say a word about President Carter, because we had a good relationship all the way through. And I think it takes some doing for a president to deal that way with someone who reminds him of his mortality, has perhaps conflicting political aspirations, and is a principal in the White House. And Carter talked about this, about how, first of all, he spent a lot of time trying to find somebody he thought he could work with. And then he told me, he said, I want the next president, if I go, to be ready that day. I don't want him to spend months getting ready. And I want somebody that I have enough confidence in that I can turn over the secrets and the rest right now. And he did that, and I'll always be grateful to him for that.
I wanted to add one element. The president did have enormous confidence in the vice president, and sent him, for example, on a very sensitive mission to see Prime Minister Begin at a very difficult time during the whole post-Camp David process, and that was, I think, a seminal visit to keep Israel in line for signing the eventual Egypt-Israel peace agreement. But that loyalty was returned, and I hope the Vice President won't mind me saying so. The period 79 to 80 was an exceptionally difficult time. It's almost impossible to recreate how difficult it was to have double-digit inflation, double-digit interest rates, hostage crisis, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, alienation of some of the key constituency groups because we had to tighten the budget and cut programs that were popular, the alienation of the Jewish community over certain steps that were taken in the Middle East and missteps that were taken on UN resolutions. And the Vice President had a very difficult, as a number of us did, time during that period, because these were the groups with whom he had grown up. They were one of the reasons he had been put on the ticket. He was the link to the constituency wing of the party. But he never, ever, in any of the situations, even privately, in the smallest meetings with some of these group leaders, ever departed from his loyalty. He always maintained it. He always tried to put the best face on what the administration is doing, while at the same time trying to turn the president, at least a few degrees, in the direction of some of their concerns. And that, to me, was an enormous tribute to him and to the president, that they had that kind of relationship, and that even at a time when you were talking, Craig, about the president dropping a vice president, This was a time of enormous stress. I don't think there was ever any inclination of the Vice President to leave. That's certainly not the case. But there was a very, very difficult period during that time as his own constituency was so alienated. And he never, ever showed disloyalty, and again, just hung in there and worked with those groups as best we could during the Kennedy challenge and during a lot of other times. And that showed, to me, an enormous amount of internal fortitude. It would have been very easy and more convenient politically, because he had a political future, to have winked and nodded at these groups and said, well, you know, that's Carter's doing, you know where I stand. Never once had that happened. And that, to me, was the true test of this man's character.
Question here.
I'd like to ask a question regarding the hostage, Morris Wolf, international lawyer, former law partner of the Honorable Harold Stassen, governor of Minnesota.
Right. It's a Minnesota connection everywhere.
Wonderful. I went to Iran, and I looked at the site where the helicopters were to drop for the visit into the city of Tehran to try to rescue those hostages. And I thought to myself, who in Lord's name could have designed a program of this sort which logistically had so little chance of succeeding? And I just wonder if you'd be kind enough to tell us what the thinking might have been that went into the plan for that particular rescue and why they thought it would succeed, and if there was either CIA information that suggested it would succeed, just what was the decision-making that happened that allowed that effort to go forward?
Well, you win the argument because of how it came out, but I will tell you what we thought we were doing. On the Desert One site you described, we sent people in there, checked the ground strength, its suitability for landing, its remoteness away from populations. We observed the site for weeks. It fit all the needs, and our plan called for airplanes and then choppers to go up to Desert One to refuel. We had bladders for refueling, and then chop up to another site, and then move the next day and try to get our hostages out of the embassy. We also had people in and around the embassy. We were talking to people who were in the embassy. We had reason to believe that if we could get to that point, we could get them out of there. Right next door was a big football or a polo field where we could assemble and bring the choppers in. We knew it was a long risk, but what was happening was real and horrible. In other words, the Iranian radicals were able to paralyze America. And that was before we had Amy Klobuchar, by the way, in the United States Senate. And this was a plan that was put together by the top people in defense, in the CIA. I was in on it, President, of course, Brzezinski, and we had a small SWAT group that was trained in this field, and we thought it might work. It didn't work. It was a tragedy. We lost lives, and it was kind of the end of the Carter administration because it was such a unexplainable disaster. But what was happening to us was a price that was beyond what a nation like ours could pay. So we had to try. The other alternative was to try to do something militarily against the Iranians. And we had suggestions about mining the harbor or bombing this or bombing that. And Carter rejected that because, one, we were pretty clear that our hostages would be, some of them could have been killed and damaged. We don't know what would happen to them. And there was no, because of the location where they were, there was no real expectation that would do us any good. And it would have further inflamed that region and I think undermined our influence even more. We were left with a fiendishly unsolvable national problem, and we did the best we could with it. History's.
Do you know why they were then released when Reagan became president? Did you participate?
When we were up all night before we went with the new president up to Capitol Hill for his swearing in, and we were negotiating all night trying to get the hostages released. And of course, Khomeini, being the fine fellow that he was, released them 1 minute after Reagan was the president. And we were in, Carter told me on the way out to the airport as he was leaving for home that they'd just been released. So I think he was playing cat and mouse with us for months.
Yes, Finley. This is Finley Lewis, who used to be my competitor for the Minneapolis Tribune and wrote a biography of Vice President Mondale.
Yeah, you found me out. Fritz, we all remember that sexy bestseller that you wrote, The Accountability of Power.
Yes.
I was just wondering if, reflecting on the last 8 years or the last 6.5 years, how you might update that book, just in a paragraph. What do you see as the lessons of this administration that we need to reflect on in terms of the way we think about accountable power?
I think it's the most important question that Americans better be thinking about, and both political parties ought to be thinking about, because I think there's a powerful argument that no one needs accountability of power more than the president. In order to manage his own government, in order to know what it is doing, in order to make certain that he is living within the law, the idea that he should be accountable to his oath, to the oversight power of the Congress, and to the Constitution is an indispensable element of the success of America. That's why we've grown and succeeded while so many of our big shot competitor nations have failed, because we've had this system that our founders developed, I think based on genius, that human nature is flawed, and persons in great power, unaccountable to others, is likely to abuse it. And so our system of government is entirely shot through with checks and balances to avoid the one moment that scared our founders the most, that we would find ourselves with an emperor too big for our system. And we're not there, but there's been a lot of contempt shown for the law, a lot of theories expounded that I don't think have any legal support about how a president, once elected, is free to do as he pleases if he'll just issue the words national security. And I think that we have to get that straight, and I think it bothers the people a lot when they think we're not obeying the law.
I think we've reached the witching hour here. We've got time for one more question, but which will go here. But first of all, I want to do two things. Apologize. I think I failed to recognize Maxine Isaacs, who was Deputy Press Secretary and the Press Secretary for Mr. Mondale's presidential campaign. She had to leave. I didn't notice until she was leaving that she was here.
Yeah.
They're having a book party for John Kerry and tonight at their place, so she had to go early to that. Second, I want to recognize Senator Amy Klobuchar, who is the first woman elected senator from Minnesota. I'm sure you'll have a chance to say hello to her at the reception, which is going to be right next door. I want to thank you all for coming, for your fine questions, and we'll take the last question over here.
Thank you. My name's Ed Spanis. I write for Executive Intelligence Review. Vice President Mondale mentioned that the president can't ask for the impeachment of his vice president, but Congress certainly can. And as you may be aware, yesterday, Congressman Dennis Kucinich introduced a resolution with draft articles of impeachment against Vice President Cheney. Two of the articles deal with Iraq, the manipulation of intelligence and the deceiving the American people, and the third is forward-looking toward Iran and the Vice President's efforts to drag us into a war with Iran. I wonder if the panel could address the advantages and implications of impeaching the Vice President first.
I don't think we should, I mean, I like Dennis, but I don't think we should do this. I think we've got a really horrendous, delicate situation in our country now in which we're divided, so much belligerence, so much hostility. It is clear, and I've talked about Cheney enough, I'm not going to do it, but I think if we opened up that approach, it could just split us apart at a time when we should be trying to reunite. I know the point he's making, but I would not go along with that strategy.
Well, I'll be less diplomatic. I think it's a ridiculous idea. I think it's a dangerous idea. I think that although I have fundamental disagreements with many of the policies of the administration, the notion that these rise to high crimes and misdemeanors, I think, is more than just a stretch. It's outlandish and counterproductive. And I want to come back again to the point that I made earlier. Whatever excesses one may attribute to the Vice President, I certainly don't think they go beyond the bounds of the law. But I think that this Vice Presidency, as it has existed, could not have existed unless the President wanted the Vice President to play the role that he's played. I think that in that sense, there's a partnership. It's not a partnership that has exceeded, I think, the law and that would even begin to rise to the level of impeachment. It is certainly one that has subjected the administration to searching public opinion. But again, I think that the notion that this has been a rogue Vice Presidency is incorrect. I don't think that that's the case. I think it's a relationship they've wanted to have in this way, and that's why I think that the corrective device is in the next election, again, to make sure, and I suspect that will be the case, that there'll be a real searching examination by the presidential nominees on both sides to choose someone who will engender trust, and hopefully that the American people will look at that running mate in more than just the casual way they have in the past.
I think that's...
Can I just,
go ahead, Craig,
second
please.
the notion? I think it's kind of absurd and make the point, which I think we did cover, but I stress, I think that if you believe, or if particularly foreign leaders believe, that a Vice President has some kind of a second agenda, that's a very perilous place to be. I don't think this Vice President has another agenda. I think, whether one likes it or not, this administration has but one agenda, and I would hope that the Vice Presidency will be a place where the Vice President is seen absolutely as a partner with the President and as a confidant to the President, unless a Vice Presidency that is kind of constantly in the media through controversy or other intentions, because I don't think that's the most effective way for the Vice President to conduct himself or herself.
I think that's a good note to end on. Mr. Vice President, thank you for coming and sharing.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stuart. Terrific.
Thank you very much. Terrific.